As long as I have a table, that's fine.
Well, good evening. I'm not quite as loud as normal, just because I've been kind of recovering from a little cold, and so I was a little hoarse a couple of days ago. So I'm almost back to full voice, but not maybe full preacher voice, if you know what I mean. Not full. So I can't really raise the level up too much. Hopefully, y'all can hear me at about this level. So welcome again. I'm glad to welcome you back. I know that last week we had Ash Wednesday, and so we didn't meet. And guess what? Next week is spring break, and we don't meet during spring break. So we have this little island of a lesson tonight. And then after spring break, I think we have 3 or 4 weeks uninterrupted. So I'll look forward to that, because get my rhythm going and our rhythm going. But yeah, just because of childcare issues, everything else, we don't meet anything on Wednesday night during spring break. So we'll be off next week for that, and then we'll be back, I say, 2 weeks from tonight, and I think we'll have about 4 weeks in a row with uninterrupted. So that's good. Welcome again. It's good to be here. I hope if some of you, welcome folks on Facebook. I told you we'd be starting. Here we are. Glad to see us. I know we have a few folks who are in choir, because the choir started back up, and they're going to be watching later online. Speaking of Facebook, if you saw, we put out a post earlier today. I just kind of want to celebrate that. A week and a half ago, we mentioned our feeling of helplessness when it comes to what we see on TV about Ukraine. Just a sense of this awful thing that's happening, and is there anything we can do about it? And I mentioned, of course, that our church has twice had mission trips to Poland. I've gotten to go to Poland twice, somewhere I never thought I'd go, but I've been to Poland twice, and made friendships with some of the other Methodist pastors, Polish Methodist pastors. And one of those friendships, a man named Sławomir, emailed me shortly after the invasion that they were knowing they were going to be receiving thousands and thousands of refugees into Poland. At this point, they've received 1.3 million refugees just into Poland. 1.3 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And of course, the Methodist Church there, as well as I'm sure all the churches and all kinds of other organizations and groups of people, are just, on the one hand, overwhelmed, but doing everything they can to provide places to sleep, food, medicine, baby formula, diapers, clothes, blankets, etc., etc., etc. The Methodist Church over there is very small compared to our churches, but they are doing everything they can. And but long story short, we thought one way we could help would be to help supply those Methodist churches in Poland, so that they could then help the Ukrainian refugees. And so all that to say, over the last 2 Sundays, folks contributed, and today we wired the money to the Polish Methodist Church, over $21,000. So, yeah. Yeah, Al?
Okay, they have the money, but with 1.3 million refugees in the country, how are they going to get the stuff?
How are they going to get the stuff?
Spend the money. What are they going to be able to spend it on? Is the stuff available for them to be able to buy?
In Poland?
Yes.
I think it is for now. I mean, luckily, I think there are not only dollars flowing into Poland, I think there are people bringing literal trucks of supplies into Poland as well.
Somebody suggested they need porta potties.
I mean, they need everything. I know all kinds of creative ways that people are trying to send help. But if you're on Facebook, we put some pictures up that Sławomir sent me yesterday of some of the people living in the Methodist churches, some of them packing boxes of food and stuff like that.
I was just curious. I mean, yeah, it's great to send money, but is there stuff to be able to spend the money on?
I think in Poland, for now, there is. And, I'm sure a lot of things with that much need, I'm sure there'll be and one due in a couple of weeks. I just think of things like formula and diapers. That's what I think of. How are they going to have enough of that? For pictures you see of these Ukrainian mothers bringing their babies across the border. I mean, it's, but I know in almost any crisis situation, money is the thing they need the most. I mean, it's one thing to try to pack up a box of blankets and mail it over there, but in reality, wiring money is probably the best thing we can do, at least at this point. I was, I think about crises. I was a pastor in Oklahoma City when the Murrah bombing happened. And I was down at the site of the Murrah bombing about an hour after the bomb went off. And at First Methodist downtown Tulsa, which was destroyed by the bomb, and et cetera. And so I was down there. One of my friends was asked by the mayor of Oklahoma City to organize the clergy response to that. Anyway, all that to say, we're down there, and it's like a movie to me, like a war scene in a movie. As they're there's people bringing casseroles, and you're like, I'm not sure what we're going to do with that at this moment in time. But this sense that people have to do something, they have to bring something. But probably casseroles at that moment were not the thing that was going to be the most helpful. But their heart was in the right place. Anyway, all that to say, I'm just proud that over, let's say, 2 Sundays, people above and beyond their just regular gifts to the church contributed over $21,000. $21,619, I think. Don't quote me on that. I think that's what it was. So, anyway, we are back. If you got to think back to 2 weeks ago where we were, you got to think back to Paul being arrested in Jerusalem. Okay, that's where Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. And last 2 weeks ago, we were in chapter 21 and 22 of Acts. And just to recap, why is he arrested? Paul has come to Jerusalem bringing, we believe, an offering, talking about offerings, an offering for the Jerusalem church that he has collected from the Gentile churches. The Jerusalem church is very poor. Paul has collected an offering from some of these Gentile churches to give to the Jerusalem church. When he gets there, the leaders of the Jerusalem church, the Jewish leaders of the Jerusalem church, the Jewish Christians, say, there's rumors that you are telling our brothers to forget the law, forget all of our Jewish customs, to forget everything about being a Jew. And we would like for you to do something to prove that you are still a good Jew. That even though you're a believer in Jesus as Messiah, you have not abandoned your Jewish heritage. So they said, we have some men who've taken a Nazirite vow, which I went into last time, and what that is. It's a vow that you take, and you don't cut your hair, and you don't drink alcohol, and for like a month, and then you go to the temple and make a special offering. And it's costly because you have to sacrifice an animal and things like that. Said, you'd like you to sponsor these men and participate with them in their offering, just to show you're still a good Jew and you're still participating in Jewish customs. Paul probably thought the whole thing was a little silly, but said, sure, I'll do that. As he's there in Jerusalem, going in and out of the temple, someone sees him going into the temple and falsely accuses him of bringing a Gentile into the temple, which was, forbidden into that inner court. To bring a Gentile past that gate is a horrible offense. And so he is falsely accused of that because he's been seen in the markets of Jerusalem with one of his Gentile friends. Somebody assumed he'd brought him into the temple, which he didn't. But someone says, this man's bringing Gentiles into the temple. This starts a riot. People are ready to kill Paul. Here comes the Romans because they hate a riot. And Paul is taken into custody. Excuse me, Paul, as he's being literally carried by Roman soldiers away from the riot, says, I want to talk to the crowd. And he talks to the crowd and incites them even more after he gives his testimony. And so the Romans, to solve a potential riot, take him into custody. They don't understand what's happened, why people are mad at him, why people want to kill him. So they decide to torture him until he tells them why. And as they basically are about to flog him, he says, is this the way you treat a Roman citizen? Flogging him without even knowing what the charges are? And that sends a bolt of fear through them because they didn't realize he was a Roman citizen. It was against the law to flog a Roman citizen, especially without any charges against him. And they're amazed that this Jewish tent maker, Saul, is a citizen. And but yes, he is a citizen. I was going to say, how does he prove his citizenship? And I think somebody looked it up. I think, Larry, you looked it up. Tell us how he proved his citizenship.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. That was 2 weeks ago.
I know, yeah.
I don't remember all the details now, but there were several things that could identify him. Basically, there was like a tablet or something that he could carry with him, or maybe a necklace that he could carry with him that had an inscription on it, and the inscription would not be something that would be carried by just the common person because they couldn't read or write. There was also apparently a good genealogy there where you'd go to the city and they would have the dates and the people when they were born. If you were a Roman citizen, that's just two examples.
So anyway, there were ways to show it. So they decide they need to bring him before the Sanhedrin. And if you remember what the Sanhedrin is, that's the Jewish council. The Sanhedrin in Jerusalem would be, for Judaism, analogous to a legislature and a Supreme Court kind of all rolled into one. Now, they didn't have any power, we know, for example, to carry out the death penalty. This is for. Remember, they had to go to the governor to get a death sentence. They couldn't carry out that kind of penalty. They mainly were there for the Jewish population to rule on religious matters, and the matters of Jewish law. It was made up of 72 elders, all men, of course, in those days. Some of them Pharisees, which is what Paul was before his conversion. Some of them Sadducees, which was a group that was where the priests came out of that group, and they were the more wealthy, connected to the Roman aristocracy group, and various other people. If you remember, Nicodemus was a member of the Sanhedrin. Joseph of Arimathea, who asked for Jesus' body, was a member of the Sanhedrin. So it's a group of 72 Jewish elders that were sort of the ruling group, of course, still under the auspices of the Roman Empire. They didn't have any power that Rome wouldn't give them. So they said, we need to bring this guy, this Paul fellow, before the Jewish Sanhedrin and see if we can figure out what all this riot was about. So now, excuse me. So the end of chapter 22:30, says, the next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. He brought Paul and had him stand before them. The chief priest presided over the Sanhedrin, the chief priest of the Jews. And remember, the chief priest was supposed to be a direct descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. But by the time of Jesus and the time of the New Testament, it had long ceased to be that. It was a political appointment. And you had to be cozy with the Romans. And there was one family, or a couple of families, that controlled the priesthood. And they passed it back and forth. Caiaphas was the high priest during Jesus' trial. His father-in-law, a man named Ananias, was high priest at one time, and then he took it back. And they passed it back and forth from father to son-in-law, and then back to father. They kept passing the job of high priest around. Of course, religiously, the high priest is the one who, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, would go into the Holy of Holies and offer the sacrifices for the nation on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. So it's in the robes and the whole thing. So it's a very important office, but the family of Ananias and Caiaphas were notoriously corrupt, signified by the fact that they're the ones who owned all the booths where they sold animals and changed the money that Jesus overturned when he drove people out of the temple. Those booths and those money changers and all those salesmen of selling the animals were all owned by the families of the high priest. It was a scam. It was a money-making thing. It was just, that's why Jesus was so mad. So anyway, so Paul is brought before this body of 72, some of them good men, some of them corrupt, some of them Pharisees, some of them Sadducees, some of them neither. So Paul's brought there. So chapter 23. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this point, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Why do you think? Why do you think? Any guesses? You think this statement seems pretty nice statement. Have any clues to why that would, why that would bring about a slap on the face? Well, no, that's not the reason the high priest had him slapped.
He talked to Ananias, the high priest, and didn't realize who it was.
He did, actually. We'll get there. The reason is one that we wouldn't think of. It's because he addressed them as my brothers. The proper way to address the Sanhedrin was, "Rulers and elders, I come before you." You did not address the Sanhedrin as brothers, a common little tent maker like Paul. You called them rulers and elders. You gave them the title of respect. It'd be like if you went into the courtroom, our business manager, Kathy Glasgow, her husband, Kurt, is a judge. If you went into his courtroom and said, "Well, Kurt, let me ask you this." You're not supposed to do that in court, are you? You're supposed to say, "Your Honor," right? If you're in a courtroom with a judge. So here, he says, "My brothers," instead of saying elders and rulers, slap him in the face. Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Now, the Jewish law said, to strike the cheek of a fellow Israelite is to strike at the very glory of God. So you were told not to strike the face of a fellow Israelite. And Paul calls him a whitewashed tomb. This is a phrase that's used a couple of times in the New Testament, which to us is like, what the heck is a whitewashed tomb? Jesus uses it talking about the Pharisees. Again, you have to think about this whole thing we've been talking about all through this about being kosher. Remember, we hear the word kosher and we just think food. We know lamb is kosher, pork is not. Okay, that's true. But kosher just is a word that means clean. Ceremonially clean. Not hygienically clean. Ceremonially clean. And so there's food that was kosher and food that wasn't kosher. But other things made you unclean. Ceremonially impure. One of those things was touching a dead body. That would make you unclean. If you happened to be going through a graveyard and you stepped on some bones of remains, that would make you unclean. Even if you stepped on a grave and accidentally touched something in the grave. So, before holidays, they would paint the gravestones white. So you would know to avoid them. So you wouldn't accidentally touch them or walk close to them. So that you would not become unclean by touching something dead. So Jesus And here Paul calls somebody a whitewashed tomb is to say you look clean on the outside, but inside you're decaying and corrupt. Okay, so he calls him a whitewashed tomb. And then the guy says, how dare you insult the high priest? And here's where you're right. It says here, oh, I didn't know it was the high priest. But as I was reading the commentary, the author, Dr. Barclay, was saying, Paul knew exactly who the guy was, but he's being a little sarcastic here, going, that's a high priest? That guy? That corrupt guy? That criminal? That's a high priest? So whether Dr. Barclay's right about that or not, Paul's pretty salty here. Because he says, oh, I didn't know he was the high priest. And then he also quotes scripture, don't speak evil about the ruler of your people, which is Exodus 22:28. Anyway, so he's off to not a good start, if you might say, in terms of Paul making friends and influencing people here at the Sanhedrin. He's a pretty rough start, getting slapped in the mouth for just saying brothers, and then calling the high priest a whitewashed wall, or a whitewashed tomb, and yelling at him. So he's not off to a good start. But Paul has a strategy here. Paul, verse 6, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. Again, you're like, well, why did he say that? Because Paul here is capitalizing on the division between Pharisee and Sadducee. Between you might think of them as being almost like political parties, but it's more about religion than it is what we think of as politics. But of course, in the ancient world, there is no separation between politics and religion. I mean, there's no difference between politics and religion. It's all just one thing. Here's the difference, some of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Pharisees was a very small group of at the time of Jesus, about 7,000 or 8,000 men who were, we might call them fundamentalists. They were extremely religious. They were dedicated to following every brushstroke, they say every jot and tittle, which is Hebrew writing, every crossing every T and dotting every I, to the minutia of the law. They were ultra religious. The Sadducees were more the aristocracy, more friendly with the Romans. See, the Pharisees the word Pharisee means the separated ones. They separated themselves from what they saw as the regular folks who weren't as religious as they were. The Sadducees, were cozy with the Romans. The Sadducees only accepted as authoritative the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They said those 5 books are the only books with authority. The Pharisees not only accepted what we call the law and the prophets, the law of Moses and the books of the prophets, they believed that the oral law, in other words, the teachings of the rabbis, also had authority. So the Sadducees believed only in the first 5 books of Moses. Pharisees believed in a much wider group of scriptures and oral tradition. The Pharisees believed in predestination. The Sadducees believed in free will. The Pharisees believed in angels. The Sadducees did not. And here's the key part. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not. So the Pharisees believed that there would be a resurrection at the end of time. The Sadducees did not believe in any life after death. So when Paul says to the whole group, I'm a Pharisee, and the only reason I'm on trial is because I believe in the resurrection. He knows he's about to start a quarrel between the two groups of the Sanhedrin. Look what happens. He says, I'm on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So this is Luke reminding us of what I just told you, this difference between Pharisee and Sadducee. See, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were so sad, you see. That's a really old seminary joke. So there's a great uproar. And some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man. They said, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So this is the result of Paul's so-called hearing before the Sanhedrin. The second thing he says causes the Sanhedrin to start fighting with themselves so violently that they have to come cart Paul away and take him away from the Sanhedrin. It's like those videos you see, some of these legislatures in some of these other countries where it breaks into fistfights in the middle of the legislature, which we may not be too far from that here. But anyway, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage, as you've testified about me and him, so you must also testify. A little foreshadowing here that Paul's deepest desire, at least one of Paul's deepest desires was always to preach in Rome. At this point in his career, he hasn't been to Rome. He hasn't been to the capital of the world, because that's what Rome was. Rome was the capital of the world. And once you get the message there, I mean, it's like spokes on a wheel. I mean, once you get to this, think about what New York, if you can make it there, you make it anywhere. But this is Rome. Once you get the message to the center of the world, the capital of the world, that message has a way to flow in all directions. So Paul wanted to get to Rome. When he wrote the book of Romans, he'd never been to Rome. Matter of fact, one of the reasons that Romans is often, of all the letters of Paul, the one quoted the most, is because in Romans, Paul isn't answering specific questions like he is the other letters. In Romans, he's just laying out his teachings. And so because he's just more laying out a more comprehensive teaching, it's why the book of Romans seems a little more organized and a little more comprehensive than some of the other letters where he's just answering a specific problem or a specific question. So God says to him, take courage, you're going to go to Rome. Then the next morning after this fiasco at the Sanhedrin, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. So think about that. There's men who, it says there was 40 of them. There were 40 men in this plot. So 40 men bind themselves together with an oath. We will not eat or drink. We will fast. We will neither eat nor drink until we see Paul dead. Which is, you can only go without water for about 3 or 4 days, So they went to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we've killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We're ready to kill him before he gets here. So some of them in the Sanhedrin are in on this plot. They're not going to wait for Rome to act. They're going to assassinate Paul on his way to a meeting with the Sanhedrin. These 40 men have bound themselves with a blood oath. And this is something that was called a cherem. And when they vowed, and they said something like this, they would say, we vow to see Paul dead. May God curse me if I fail. May God curse me if I fail to kill Paul. That was the way they bound themselves with this vow. So, but, verse 16. When the son of Paul's sister heard of the plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Now, we don't even know this man's name. Paul's nephew, his sister's son. But Paul has a nephew, and how he hears about the plot, again, but anytime. 40 men keeping a secret? How easy would that be for 40 men to keep a secret, and not brag about it, and not tell their wives about it, and tell their friends about it, and tell their parents about it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, Paul's nephew hears about it. And he goes to Paul in the barracks, in the jail, where Paul's being held. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." And he took him to the commander. So, please take my nephew to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring you this young man. He has something to tell you." Well, the commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside. He's obviously probably a teenager at this, or maybe a young person. "What do you want to tell me?" "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in an ambush for him. They've taken an oath not to eat or drink until they've killed him. They're ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." So, the commander finds out about this plot. The commander dismissed the young man, cautioned him, "Don't tell anybody that you've reported this to me." So, through this young man and through, we would say, divine intervention there as well, this plot is foiled. You wonder, okay, did these guys all starve to death then? I kind of doubt it, but you'd think if they failed, they weren't going to eat or drink. So, he, being the commander, called in two of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide mounts for Paul. He can be taken safely to Governor Felix." Rome was divided into provinces. And you would think Judea, that the headquarters of the governor of the province would be Jerusalem. It wasn't. It was Caesarea. Okay. Caesarea is where the governor's office was in the province of Judea. You'd think, it's like, you mean New York City isn't the capital of the state of New York? No, it's Albany. So Jerusalem was not the seat of the governor of Judea. It was Caesarea. So he says, and because he's aware of this plot of assassination, he's going to send a show of force to take Paul to the governor, to Felix. And so he writes a letter to the governor, Felix. And the commander, we find out his name is Claudius Lysias. Commander Claudius Lysias writes this letter to Governor Felix. "Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned he's a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. It had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So I'm going to send this guy up the chain somebody else can deal with him. So he sends him to the governor, Felix. Now, Caesarea, as I say, is the seat of the governor of Judea, the province of Judea. There was what's called the Praetorium, which was the governor's residence, which actually in Caesarea was a house built by Herod the Great. Caesarea is about 60 miles from Jerusalem. And so they start carrying him they start taking Paul towards Caesarea. And they leave in the evening. It says and they leave at night, I think, to avoid the potential ambush. The soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night, brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with them while they returned to the barracks. Now, you might say, why? Well, luckily, again, we know people who know the geography and the history. Antipatris was about halfway between Jerusalem and Caesarea. The first 30 miles, there were lots of little crannies and curves and caves and places where a bunch of people could hide out for an ambush. There was a lot of places where there could be people waiting to jump out and kill somebody. Once you got to Antipatris, the rest of the way to Caesarea was pretty much just flat open road where there wasn't really anywhere to hide. And that's why halfway they had soldiers with them. Once they got to that spot and there was nowhere for a mob or a bunch of assassins to hide, they sent part of the soldiers back and the rest of them took him the rest of the way to Caesarea. When the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor, handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter, asked what province he was from, he being Paul. Learning that he was from Cilicia, in other words, Paul is from Tarsus, remember. He said, I'll hear your case when your accusers get here. He ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace, which is the Praetorium. So now Paul has been transferred from Jerusalem to Caesarea. And he's now under the guard of Felix. What do we know about Felix? Not Felix the cat. Some of you old enough to remember The Odd Couple, Felix Unger, and not that many people named Felix anymore, I guess. But anyway, Felix had been the governor of Judea at this point in the story for 5 years. He has a unique life story. Felix has a unique life story. Felix began life as a slave, which he is the only person in Roman history where a slave became a governor. The only example in all of Roman history where a slave became a governor. How did that happen? Well, his brother, Felix's brother, Pallas, was a buddy of Nero. And it was that connection with Nero that allowed this slave to rise up to the rank of governor. And the Roman historians said that he ruled like a slave would. In other words, he was, this was a slam, but he was corrupt, always looking for bribes, always, dealing under the table, completely unscrupulous. He had a band of thugs to get rid of his political enemies. He was a thug as governor. He was currently on his third wife by this time in the story. We don't know the name of his first wife. His second wife was the granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra. If you know that story. But his current wife was the daughter of King Agrippa, King Herod Agrippa the First. Now, you remember our Herod family tree? Herod Agrippa the First was Herod the Great's grandson. Okay, if anybody didn't get this, this is the Herod family tree. If anybody wants another copy of this, here, I'll put it out here, and you can, if anybody wants to come get one later on, they can. So he's got some famous wives. So Felix is not a good guy, not a good governor, but that's where now Paul has been brought. Brought to Governor Felix. And they said, and he says to Paul, as soon as your accusers get here, we'll have a hearing. So, chapter 24. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. Okay. So he brings a lawyer, an accuser, you might say. Matter of fact, I think the term in some Bibles, the Roman term was a pleader, to plead the case. So the high priest brings a lawyer with him. They brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus, the lawyer, presented his case before Felix. So this is the high priest's lawyer making his case against Paul. He said, and here's, at least how Luke shares the gist of the argument. He says to Felix, "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude." Every word of that's a lie. Felix was a terrible governor. But of course he starts, because he's smart, by, telling the governor how great he is, how wise he is, how wonderful his rule has been. Okay, so that's how he starts. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude, dripping with insincerity. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you'll be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. The Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. So, let's see what these charges mount up to. 1, you are charged with being a troublemaker. The charge against you, troublemaker. Now, there are countries in our world today where that really is a charge. North Korea, China, there's lots of places where basically that is the charge against somebody. You're a troublemaker. You're a malcontent. You're a rabble-rouser. So Paul's accused of being a troublemaker. It says he started riots. That's really a twisting of reality. I mean, sometimes the Jews, upon hearing him preach, would start a riot. But to call him someone who starts riots is not true or fair. A ringleader of the Nazarene sect. Is he a leader of the Church of Jesus? Which, that Jesus was often called by the Romans the Nazarene, because he was from Nazareth. Paul is definitely a missionary and pastor of Christianity, but the word sect implies a violent insurrectionist. There were sects that were dedicated to overthrowing Rome. And just the word sect there is kind of a prerogative or pejorative word that implies that he's involved in some nefarious plots. He tried to desecrate the temple, which we know wasn't true. That is the real charge that brought him in, because he was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple, which he didn't do. And so that's his case, basically. He's a troublemaker. He starts riots. He's a leader of the Nazarenes, and he brought somebody into the temple. Really, all those charges fall flat. But the lawyer thinks this is a sufficient charge to get Felix's attention.
But the lawyer could look back on he started rioting in the Sanhedrin. And the fact that Paul agreed to go with the Nazarenes.
Yeah, you say, Paul started to write in the Sanhedrin by saying, I believe in the resurrection, Well, this guy's not so bad, yeah. I think he's all right. Well, I don't, yeah. When I first came to be interviewed for ordination, when I was first graduated seminary, I was brought into a room with 30 pastors. And I'd completed my 30-page paper, and I had 30 pastors looking at me as I just came out of seminary. And, they asked me, the first question they asked me was, why did you get a master's in philosophy before you went to seminary? And I told them I thought it would just be good grounding. And the second question they asked me was about my view of baptism. And they asked me the question, and before I could answer, somebody else on the committee said, well, I don't think that's a very good question because blah, 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 blah. And somebody else said, well, I disagree. And for the next 5 minutes, they argued among themselves while I sat there, at which point the chairman said, well, Larry, thank you for coming in. And they voted, and 2 minutes later they brought me in and told me I passed. So, but I only answered one question, and the second question caused a debate among the rest of them that I just sat there and kept my mouth shut. So, now, anyway. So that's the charge against Paul. Verse 10. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you've been a judge over this nation. He's talking to Felix here. So I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues, or anywhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that agrees with the law, and it is written in the prophets. I have the same hope in God as these men, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. I mean, compare this to the lawyers. I mean, it's coming out very logically, very, After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it was this one thing I stood in there. I'm on trial before you today. So he's like, well, I said that in the Sanhedrin. That seemed to start a big fuss. And at that point, Felix interrupts him. Felix says, who was well acquainted with the way. Remember, this is the way they refer to Christianity, the Christian movement, the way. Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I'll decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and to permit his friends to take care of his needs. Because remember, prison in the first century, they don't serve you 3 square meals a day. They don't provide you with writing paper or pen. They don't provide you with clothes. They don't provide you with clean underwear. They don't provide you with anything. Your friends have to supply all that. And if you're sent to jail and you don't have any friends, you don't have anything. So, several days later, Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was a Jewess. Remember, I mentioned that she is the daughter of Herod Agrippa the First. His wife, Drusilla, is part of the Herod family. Comes with his wife, Drusilla. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I'll send for you. Now, he's some of this talk is making him uncomfortable. Now, you might say, why is he afraid? Well, his current wife, he stole his current wife from another man. Drusilla had been married to a man named Azius, the king of king of Emesa. But Felix wanted to steal her from this guy, wanted Drusilla, wanted to be married to the daughter of Herod. And so he hired a magician, a sorcerer, to help him in this effort to steal her away from this other man. You might say, given what we know about Felix, his thuggery, his lack of scruples, here, this particularly the way in which he gained his third wife, when Paul starts talking about righteousness and all of this, it makes him rather uncomfortable. Righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. The judgment to come. He becomes quite uncomfortable and says, it's enough of that. We'll reconvene at a later time. Verse 26. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. How long did this go on? Verse 27. When 2 years had passed, so Felix keeps Paul holed up there for 2 years. Saying, we'll get around to that some other time. We'll hear you again. 2 years. 2 years Paul is there. Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. Because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. He is hoping to curry some favor. You say, well, why does he leave the post of governor? Well, he leaves the post of governor because in Caesarea, remember Caesarea is pretty far from the center, from Jerusalem, from the center of Judaism. There's a lot of Jews in Caesarea, but there's also a lot of Gentiles in Caesarea. There is a conflict there that turns into a riot. What do the Romans hate? Riots. Turns into a riot in which thousands of Jews are murdered. The Gentiles then loot their homes, take all their stuff, and the remaining Jews send a complaint to Caesar about the whole episode, and Felix is recalled as governor. It's only his friendship, or his brother's friendship with Nero, that keeps him from probably being imprisoned or even executed over all of this. Because the Romans hate riots. So, 2 years, that's why Felix is recalled by Rome, and they send a new governor, Festus. Again, which Anybody? I know people who are my age or older. Gunsmoke. The deputy was named Festus. You remember that? Okay. Again, not too many modern people named Festus anymore. What are you remembering Festus?
I do, but she doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that show went off the air in the 70s, right? I mean, I think. Oh, it was the longest running. It was the longest running show on. I'm not counting news shows like Meet the Press. It was the longest running fictional show on television in terms of number of seasons. It was the longest running show in television history until it was surpassed by trivia. The Simpsons. Yeah, The Simpsons. The Simpsons. The Simpsons is the longest running show in television history. Yeah. Anyway, it's a long way to go from Festus, right? But anyway, so Festus comes to be the new governor of the province of Judea. So let's read a little bit more. The trial before Festus now. Paul is still stuck there in Caesarea. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. Okay, they haven't given up on this. 2 years later, they're still wanting to get Paul. They're still wanting to get him convicted and hopefully killed. So they presented him. They urgently requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. They still got the idea, if we can just get him on the road, if we just get him here, we can assassinate him. So they want him out from the safety of Caesarea and the Praetorium back to Jerusalem, and then so that somewhere along the way he can be killed. They don't tell Festus that, obviously. They just say, we want him here in Jerusalem to answer these charges. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he's done anything wrong. So he doesn't buy into this. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who'd come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. And in your picturing, just them all kind of yelling at the same time, pointing their fingers like that. Then Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. I haven't broken Jewish law. I haven't broken Roman law. I haven't done anything wrong. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Now, Paul knows what's up here. Remember, Paul was made aware of the plot way back when by his nephew. Paul's answered, I now am standing before Caesar's court. In other words, you're the governor. You're appointed by Caesar. I'm right where I should be. This is the appropriate place for my trial. Not Jerusalem, but here where the governors lives. I've not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I don't refuse to die. But if the charges that brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you've appealed to Caesar you will go. Now this is Roman law. Paul knows to travel to Jerusalem would probably mean an ambush and potentially his death. He again reiterates, this is the place for a trial. You're Caesar's man. I haven't anything wrong. If I have done something wrong, I'm willing to pay the price, but I haven't. But basically saying, it doesn't look like I'm going to get a fair shake here. I appeal to Caesar. This was the right of a Roman citizen who felt like he was not being treated fairly in a Roman court. Now, there was not just any Roman citizen. If a Roman citizen was caught murdering somebody, caught red-handed thieving or in thievery, was a pirate, they couldn't appeal to Caesar. But for other charges, if you're a Roman citizen and you appeal to Caesar, you had to be sent to Caesar to appeal to the emperor himself. Like this is going to the Supreme Court. This is going to the ultimate authority, to the Roman emperor himself. And so he says, Paul says, I appeal as a Roman citizen, I appeal to Caesar. And Festus confers with, the legal experts who help him, like, do we have to send him there? Yeah, you have to send, that's the law. And he's like, all right, you got it, okay, you're going to go to Rome, I guess. I guess we're sending him to Rome. So once he appeals to Caesar, they have to send him to Rome. And here, so you think, oh, they're going to stick him on a boat right away. Well, not quite. Okay, let's see what else happens in this chapter. Because a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. This is Agrippa the Second. Okay? So, if you're, and if anybody else was, I know that we put one at least at each table here. So, because this gets complicated if you don't have it handy. Let's see. Let's see. Folks online, I'm coming back in a second. Okay. I'm back. Okay, so this is Agrippa the Second. If you go all the way to the bottom of the chart, this is Agrippa the Second. So you go all the way up the top, and you got Herod the Great. Herod the Great, remember, is the one who ordered the babies to be killed in Bethlehem. Herod the Great's the one who added on to the temple until they called it Herod's temple. That's why he's called Herod the Great, because of all of his building projects. So he has multiple wives, and it shows the various sons he had, in the next line. One of those sons was by his wife Miriam, Herod Philip the First. One of those was Alexander, was Aristobulus, Antipater, Herod Archelaus. They all have the name Herod. If you go to Aristobulus, he is the father of Herod Agrippa the First. And then Herod Agrippa the First has his son, Herod Agrippa the Second, as well as two daughters, Bernice and Drusilla. Now, we already talked about Drusilla, who's married to Felix. Right? It says Herod Agrippa II arrives with Bernice. Here's where it gets really twisted. We believe that Agrippa II married his sister. That Bernice was both his sister and his wife. So, then this is corroborated by a lot of Roman history that that Agrippa II and Bernice had an incestuous relationship. So, and remember, as I said, Bernice, the other sister, Drusilla, was the one who was married to Felix that he stole away from the other guy. So this is how this twisted family tree of Herod goes. So Agrippa II arrives with Bernice to pay his respects to Festus, because when Herod the Great died, king of the Jews, and remember, but still under the control of the Roman emperor, given the title of king as a favor. When Herod the Great dies, they parcel out his territory to his various sons. They call them the tetrarchs because they were divided into 4 pieces. And you see, it keeps getting chopped into smaller and smaller pieces. And some of those territories are not ruled by a Herod family member at all. They're simply ruled by a Roman governor, like Pilate, or in this case, Festus. But Herod Agrippa II still had a little piece of territory that was under his control. So he comes to pay his respects to Festus, to Caesarea. And it says, since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with him. Paul's case with the king. He said, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told him it's not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he's faced his accusers. This had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I didn't delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. Excuse me. When his accusers got up to speak, they didn't charge him with any of the crimes I'd expected. Said they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion, about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. And Agrippa says to Festus, I'd like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you'll hear him. So notice how he describes, like, this is all about their religion. I don't get it, you know. All the charges against him seem to have something to do with the Jewish religion. I even know what the charges against him are at this point. So, excuse me. So the next day, see, at least Festus is a lot more proactive than Felix. All right, let's get it done. So the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. So they're wearing their royal robes. You know, they're wearing all their purple and everything. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting the ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I've brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. I think it's unreasonable to send a prisoner without specifying the charge against him. So he's in a coin. He's like, all right, he's appealed to Caesar. I got to send him to Caesar, but I also have to send with him a letter saying this man is accused of breaking this Roman law. He says, I don't know what to write. He doesn't seem to have broken any Roman law. If he hadn't appealed to Caesar, maybe I could have just let him go. But he's appealed to Caesar. I got to send him to Caesar. I don't even know what to write in the letter. So, King Agrippa, you know, you're a Jew. Maybe you can help me sort this out and figure out what to put in the letter. So, let's just take a couple minutes. Paul's speech here is quite lengthy. I'm not going to go through all of it. Let's read this the first little bit here. So Agrippa said to Paul, you've permission to speak for yourself. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. Now I want you to picture the scene here. Here's a king and his queen, yuck, his sister, wife, queen. Okay, here's a king wearing his royal robes and everybody's dressed in their finery. Here's a Roman governor also, you know, wearing the purple sash and the whole thing. Here's centurions, you know, in all their stuff. I mean, everybody's all, you know, looking very official and, you know, royal. And they bring in Paul in chains, this little Jewish tent maker. And you start to see, like, who commands the room? You know, who is the most dynamic person in the room? You know, it's Paul. Paul, even though he's literally in chains, he's probably wearing a shabby robe, and there's all these glittering people all around him. As he begins to talk, you can feel like, who's on trial here? who's the one who's judging whom at this point? And let's read at least the first part of his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense. Matter of fact, you know what? Turn back to Matthew 10:18 for just a second. Matthew 10:18. Matthew is sending out the disciples. Matthew 10, actually 10:17. Let's start at 10:17. Jesus is sending out the 12. Matthew 10:17. Be on your guard against men. They'll hand you over to the local councils and flog you in their synagogues. On my account, you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry what to say or how to say it. At that time, you'll be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father is speaking through you. Jesus says you'll be brought before kings and governors. Who is Paul being brought before at this very moment? A king and a governor. I consider myself fortunate. Paul knew this. Paul probably had heard that from Jesus. I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusation of the Jews. Especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. The Jews all know the way I've lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They've known me for a long time and can testify, if they're willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. And now it's because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I'm on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. O King, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? Then he launches into his testimony, as we might say. And I'm going to quit a little early because I've got to have a voice for tomorrow morning. I'm doing a very sad funeral tomorrow, as you may have heard. Jamie Caldwell, young woman, 27 years old, who, after battling cancer for 13 years, did pass away last week. And so I'm going to save my voice a little bit for that service. But any other questions about anything we've read so far? I mean, I always picture this like a movie, I just picture this, these governors playing their games, the Paul brought into this room with all these people, and, the Jewish lawyer, being, sniveling and complimenting the governor, what a great guy he is, and making these vague charges of being a troublemaker. And Paul's very rational, very factual defense. I just see this kind of playing out like a courtroom drama, like in a movie. But, of course, we're going to see, how we start at the beginning. We say, what is the, if you had a diagram, what is the book of Acts about? At least one person has said that the book of Acts is about how does the gospel get from Jerusalem to Rome? That's the arc of the story. How does the gospel travel from Jerusalem to Rome? And we're about to see, of course, how it does in this last part. How does the gospel finally get to the capital, to Rome, through not the way Paul expected to go to Rome, but a way that got him there and had incredible influence. And of course, he wrote some of the most important letters of his life from Rome. So let's have a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this a fascinating history in the life of your servant Paul. Lord, we just amazed at somehow how the prophecies and how the situation all comes together in such a way that the gospel was planted and spread and grew, and down to us today. So help us to continue to plant seeds as we go forward. We pray in your name. Amen. All right. You got to remember this now for 2 weeks, okay? Because, again, come. And, you may realize, well, we're getting pretty close to the end, so we probably have 1 or 2 more weeks actually in the book of Acts, and then we're going to spend a few weeks, as I said, beyond, talking about church history beyond the book of Acts. So, anyway, we will see you all hopefully Sunday, okay?